Yeah.
Like the idea to do it faster.
So, yeah. So I've been advised to stay away from the mic, and that's an advice I've been getting more or less all my life. So I'll stick to it. I will stay away from the mic. Let me sort of try and make my presentation in exactly the opposite direction from which that Ruthin did. So I'll begin with the FRBM. Let me put it this way. Ruthin said that this government has really, in a sense, trivialized FRBM. But one can put it slightly differently. They haven't. They've actually invoked the FRBM and stayed within a particular provision of its clause, not all the provisions that Ruthin would like. The question, of course, is that given the entire presentation that Ruthin made, was the escape clause enough? Well, number one, the growth has not slipped by 3%. Therefore, and that's the point he's making, the escape clause was not invocable. But supposing it had fallen by 3%, would this 0.5% of GDP increase in the fiscal deficit help? I think most of your economists just do fairly straightforward, uncluttered exercise in how multipliers work. And this was a point I made when the FRBM was framed, saying that if you're talking about a 3% trigger, then your escape clause cannot and should not be less than 1%, maybe higher. All right? So at one level, yes, they violated the FRBM. At the other level, if you violated the FRBM, for God's sake, just go ahead and do it thoroughly. Yeah, I mean, there's no point having half a fig leaf. The other half is showing. So let's put that aside. But I think there's a much more fundamental problem that Ruthin really didn't get to. So for the last several years, 3-4 years, there's been a huge amount of talk about the twin balance sheet problem. This was the contribution of our previous Chief Economic Advisor, Subramanian. Right? We all know about the twin balance sheet problem. Do you remember what the twin balance sheet problem is? It is corporates have a hole in their balance sheet, which gets translated into a hole in the balance sheet of banks. This was the twin balance sheet that was talked about. I think there is another twin balance sheet problem which is even more serious. And it comes directly from what Ruthin has been saying. I'm not going to repeat those numbers. If you want them put up, he can do so. But let me submit to you the following. Ruthin has consistently talked about cutting expenditures, and he's shown the numbers of the extent to which expenditures have been cut. Here's the question. What does it mean when the government cuts expenditures? Is there only one way it can be done? That is, you don't spend? And the answer, unfortunately, is a no. There is another way that you can cut expenditures. And that is, don't pay your bills. Under the government accounting system, which is what's called a cash-based system, a bill not paid is exactly equal to a bill not raised. Two very different things. Most economic students are kind of fuzzy on how corporate balance sheets work. Let me just tell you this. Supposing the government doesn't actually incur an expenditure, doesn't place an order, what happens? The top line of the company goes down because a consumer has not bought, right? And then when the top line comes down, the costs come down, pari passu, and so on, and then the bottom line comes down. What happens when the government doesn't pay or the customer doesn't pay? The top line certainly comes down because the company hasn't received the money, But the costs actually go up because the company has incurred the expenses for providing that good or service. So the bottom line shrinks much more dramatically than the shrinkage in the top line. We've now been seeing this for 3 consecutive years. So what you have now is a twin balance sheet problem, which is the government has a balance sheet problem, which has been translated into a balance sheet problem for all other entities in the country. This includes states. Rotin has already talked about it. Roughly 0.3% of GDP increase in the state's fiscal deficit, entirely due to non-payment of central government dues. PSUs. Today, the Indian PSUs, especially the good PSUs, have been hollowed out completely. Their asset base is now very, very questionable. On paper, they have assets. They bought each other's shares and given the money to government. So a lot of the so-called disinvestment proceeds that you're talking about, the non-tax receipt proceeds, is not, as he said, it's not disinvestment. What it is one PSU buying the shares of another PSU from the government. So the PSUs have essentially traded in their liquid assets for non-performing assets of other PSUs. So that's the second. The third are companies, non-private companies. So you have vendors to the government, whether these are construction companies or whatever, who haven't been paid their bills. Their balance sheet is broken. And finally, there's us. The amount of money that has been held up in terms of transfers is large. Now, all of that is showing up as reduced expenditures. So you have one balance sheet problem then getting spread out over the entire economic system. And take it from me, when that happens, there is a multiplier that works there. Because it then moves on to the vendors and suppliers, to all these other entities. And that's what really we are experiencing today. But having done all of this, you have this issue of financing the fiscal deficit, right? And Rotin brought out very clearly what was happening is that there's borrowing from the NSSF that the government does, right? And Rotin thinks that that's a sleight of hand. It really isn't. Think of what the NSSF is. NSSF receives the funds that are collected through the small savings schemes of Government of India. Every one of these schemes are not guaranteed by Government of India. They are in fact technically the debt of Government of India. When we put our money into a public provident fund or into a pension fund, these are direct liabilities of Government of India. The NSSF was a fiction that was created to take that liability seemingly off. Now, Rotin also talked about the NSSF actually lending these funds and earning the interest to service its liabilities. But there are restrictions on who NSSF can lend to. NSSF can't lend to anybody and everybody. You can't walk up to the NSSF office and say, I would like a loan of 1.5 lakhs to buy a house. Can't be done. It can only be center, state, municipal governments and PSUs. So the NSSF is a lovely little shell game between different arms of government. Right? So let's keep NSSF out of this because this is a pretension. The real question is what? The real question is all of NSSF interest liabilities are the liabilities of the central government. Now, what has been happening is the following. NSSF charges its borrowers 0.5 percentage point more than its own interest burden. So they have an interest margin of about 0.5%, 50 basis points, which comes to about 8.5%. If the central government issues bonds today, it borrows at 7%. So what the government has done is it has essentially shoved the NSSF liability off its own hands into the hands of much weaker entities like PSUs in particular and FCI especially, and reduced its own interest liability by borrowing from the market. So it's a double whammy. I mean, this is in addition to the balance sheet problem that I was talking about. So one needs to be a little careful on this account. Its consequences are actually fairly large, because think of what happens when the government switches from borrowing from the NSSF to borrowing from the market. What happens? There is then an increase in the amount of government bonds in the market. When that happens, there is a slight upward pressure on interest rates. Okay? So the government is gaining, but at the expense of pushing up interest rates for everybody else. Now, the macroeconomic consequences at the moment still aren't that large, but if this trend goes on, as I'm almost certain it will, because NSSF is now running out of money, NSSF doesn't have much left, you're going to get a situation where all efforts by RBI to lower interest rates are going to get offset by this little sleight of hand that is being done in the budget. Okay, so much for the budget and Rothin's points. Let me get on to two things which have been in the news lately. First of all, let me begin with this business of household savings. I don't know how many of you have been following this discussion in the papers, that we have today a terrible situation where the net household savings are 6.7% of GDP, and the total demand by government, center, state, and municipal bodies is above 7%, which means that households are not saving enough to meet even the current needs of government, and therefore the government is really pulling savings out of the corporates and reducing the corporates' ability to invest. This is the discourse. Now, unfortunately, there's a certain lack of understanding as to how these things work. To begin with, let's talk about who's making what decision. Households do not determine net household savings. Households determine gross household savings. We decide how much we want to save and we put it into banks or mutual funds or wherever it is. Right? That's what we determine as households. Gross household savings continues to be on trend, going up. So where does this net problem arise from? It arises out of portfolio decisions that are being made by the financial sector. And how does that work? Well, if the financial sector chooses to lend either to retail borrowers, which is households, which we borrow for things like buying consumer durables, housing, and so on, or it lends to unincorporated enterprises. So that's one choice. The other choice is that the banks choose to lend to corporates. What has happened over the last 2 years is banks have been switching their portfolio away from corporates towards non-corporates and households. What this does in effect is show two things. First, whatever problems the banks have, they think that the corporate problem is even more serious than what the rest of us think of. They are not willing to lend to corporates. So the problem for corporates is not just the original balance sheet problem, but a problem which now has become a part of our flow story in terms of the macroeconomy. And this is a story we are really not picking up. And mind you, these numbers are not small. So if you look at the non-corporate lending of the banking sector, it has gone up by roughly 4 percentage points of GDP, which is huge. So there is a problem there which we still haven't got our heads around, but in terms of a macro challenge, that's massive. And then let me come to my final point. And this is this absolutely wonderful jewel in the Indian crown, which is the Sensex, the stock market at large. We all know the economy is tanking, but the stock market doesn't seem to know that. The stock market is going great guns. Right? It's hitting new highs. It took a bit of a slump after the budget, but then the day after that it recovered and promptly went up by 1,000 points. What is happening to the stock market? I mean, is the stock market really irrational? Is there some level of stupidity working out there? And the answer is no. You need to look for the answer elsewhere. We keep talking about monetary policy. I mean, you guys learn monetary policy. Unfortunately, we don't think it through. So, what is it's not even a stylized fact, it is in fact a real fact that after almost 5 years of very tight monetary control, the last 3 years, there's been massive injection of liquidity, of cash liquidity, into the Indian economy by the RBI. Now, the RBI can't simply print cash. I mean, much as textbook economics would like, helicopter money doesn't exist as of now. The RBI can produce cash only two ways. Number one is it buys foreign exchange. Number two, it buys central government bonds. There is no third way that it can be done. Now, if you look at what has happened over these 3 years, there's been some foreign exchange accretion, but it's not that large, and most of it's happened very recently. The bulk of it has come essentially from RBI purchases of government bonds in the market. And I use the word market advisedly. The market is the place where the government itself is not a participant. So who are participants? You have RBI as the buyer, and as sellers, you have all the entities who happen to hold government bonds. Okay? So let me split the supplier side into two categories. Banks, who are large holders of government bonds, and everybody else, which includes insurance companies, all sorts of finance companies, corporates for their treasury operations, and foreign portfolio investors. As it happens, if you look at the bank holdings of government bonds, they have sold very, very little. Almost the entire amount has come from non-banking sector holdings of government bonds. Now, what's the difference? Or does it make a difference at all? And the answer is yes, it makes a great deal of difference. The banks hold government bonds as a way, either because they're compelled to do so by the SLR, the statutory liquidity ratio, or as a part of their treasury operations. If they hold it as a part of treasury operations, then they can sell it, and what they would do with the money would be one of two things. They could either buy some other asset in their treasury, or they could put those funds in to further credit expansion. Right? So they have that choice depending upon the situation. But what about the non-banking sector? The non-banking sector, the entire holding is nothing but treasury. So when they're selling a particular treasury asset, the only thing they can do is to buy another asset in place of it, to replace the treasury. And that is what has been happening. So if you are thinking about the Indian stock market and why it's doing so well, it's because practically the entire cash that RBI produces is finding its way in the first round into the stock market. It then, of course, will come back into the banking sector eventually. But the first round effect, which is the strongest of the effects, is in the stock market. So the fact of the matter is that the boom that we are seeing in the stock market is not because everybody thinks that India is a great story. It is mainly because that is where the entire liquidity of the economy is getting parked. It's a serious problem, and it's something we need to think about, and in a sense it goes back to the old discourse, which now a lot of people have stopped talking about, is what is the state of Indian banks, and has there been a significant change in their behavior? I submit to you that there has been a very significant change, and we are still not ready to grapple with the consequences. Thank you.